pleased to introduce our very first speaker, who is Dr. Bridget Pratt, a Mater and Associate Professor in Health Ethics at the Austrian Catholic University. Bridget is also a leading expert and published scholar and in global health ethics and solidarity. And she's also a co-investigator on the Global Health Solidarity Project. Bridget will begin by presenting the key findings, and after her presentation, she will introduce the next speakers who will build on those findings. So Bridget, over to you.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I would like to start out by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yugara people upon whose lands I am giving my talk today. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their stewardship of Meanjin, which is the Indigenous name for Brisbane, which is where I'm speaking to you from in Australia. So myself and Jayoon, who is also here tonight, we were responsible for organizing the regional workshop for Australia, New Zealand, stay on the first slide, please, and the wider Pacific. Can we go back one slide? Thanks. First slide, just stay on the first slide for now, please. We were responsible for organizing that workshop last year. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we went about organizing it, and then some of the key themes that emerged, and also why we've chosen to have speakers speaking about certain themes today. So when Jayoon and I started planning for the workshop, please stay on the first slide until I say to go to the next one. We wanted to make the workshop participatory, and we really wanted to fall towards, the more meaningful end of the spectrum of participatory, because, participation can flow from, the shallow end to the more meaningful end. And so we really wanted to create a workshop that reflected a diversity of scholar and activist participants. We wanted to ensure that different types of people were present in numbers. So like we didn't just have, one person representing an organization or a particular perspective. And we also wanted to create an environment where everybody felt comfortable speaking, saying what they thought, and felt like they left the workshop being listened to and being heard. And so meaningful participation starts from the planning stage. And so I think one of the key features of our workshop was that Jayoon and I did our best to engage with all of the different participants that agreed to come, and to get their input on how we designed the format of the workshop and its content. And I think one of the first things that we learned as part of that process is reflected in the title that we chose, which is about solidarity and adjacent concepts. Because in one of our first meetings, we learned, probably unsurprisingly, that solidarity is not actually a term that Indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand actually use. So it would be rather offensive for us to go and invite people to a workshop about solidarity, because that would immediately imply that we really didn't know anything about their culture, and it's not something that they would necessarily think they would have something to contribute to. So we made sure that the workshop title and content really let people know who are participating that it was not just solidarity, it was also encompassing broader concepts that they could bring to us and tell us about from their perspective and cultures. And so we had, next slide, please, a really diverse mix of scholars and activists, and a lot of people wore multiple hats. So we had people from philosophy, theology, the arts, and ethics, and we had activists across, the health space, people working in terms of asylum seeker and migrant rights, focusing on sex worker rights, the rights of people living with disability, and also Indigenous rights and sovereignty. And in terms of the flow of the workshop, next slide, based on inputs from our participants and also the wider collaborative solidarity grant team, we started out with a yarning circle that was led by the Australian Catholic University's First Peoples Directorate. And so yarning circles are a conversational process used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which they've been using for thousands of years. And it involves telling your story. So we asked all participants to share, their story and their experiences of solidarity in their regular life or in their work practice. And so we heard from everybody at the meeting in that session. And then we had several talks on Indigenous understandings of solidarity from the Pacific Islander perspective, from the Aboriginal Australian perspective, and from the Maori perspective from New Zealand. And we had small group work associated with those talks and a broader group discussion. And then we shifted to talks about applied ethics. We had a first talk with a bit of a theology slant, which was around Catholic social teaching and Catholic understandings of solidarity. And then we had two additional talks with bioethics perspectives on solidarity, and then environmental ethics perspectives on solidarity. And we closed out with a number of vignettes of actionable solidarity, and then had smaller group and wider group discussions around those vignettes. And so the vignettes, we had 5. So we had solidarity with refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. We had sex worker solidarity, solidarity with people living with disability, solidarity between Maori and non-Maori peoples in New Zealand, and also a talk on solidarity, sovereignty, and Aboriginal art and humor. And next slide, please. And so a number of themes came out of those sessions, and the themes on this slide aren't an exhaustive list, but I've pulled them out, and the first 3 specifically are the ones that our speakers today will focus on. And so I've pulled these out for this webinar because these were the ones that Jayoon and I thought were, if we think about what they mean for global health, it can really push global health to take quite a different approach to how it currently operates. And so we thought that it would be really useful to have a wider group discussion around, what those themes would mean for global health. And I'm not sure, I think the slides have stopped sharing for everybody, but I'll press on. So the first theme, which our first speaker will discuss in much more depth, is around relationality. And that, isn't just relationality with people, humans who exist now. It's also relationality with our ancestors, with future generations, and with non-human nature. The second theme that came out of the workshop was around slowing down and an ethics of restraint where, we pause. We don't keep going as fast as possible to produce as much as possible. We take the time to regenerate and not assume that the fastest pace is the best option. And then we also discussed solidarity and allyship and connections on the basis of difference. And this links into the fact that solidarity is often discussed in relation to connections on the basis of similarities. And something that kept coming up in our workshop was around, either connections based on difference or connections that can occur through a shared purpose, but recognize that differences exist amongst the people in solidarity with each other. So the focus wasn't so much on similarities, but it was on acknowledging differences that exist. And this links into the theme around othering, which also came up quite a few times. And that was around the fact that, the boundaries of similarity can often lead to an emotional withdrawal of empathy, resulting in othering. And we had speakers talk about the othering of humans. We heard about the othering of people living with disability during COVID. And we also had speakers talk about the othering of non-humans. And the message from our speakers was around the fact that othering instincts must be challenged. So in relation to global health, it made me wonder, what othering instincts do we see in global health, and how can we challenge those instincts? We had a speaker talk about mutual contradictions and talking about how recognizing contradictions as mutual rather than as competing, this enables us to live in a world with multiple realities. And the important point here was around our recognition of mutual contradictions requires constant negotiation so no one is excluded. So it's about navigating our differences. And this was contrasted with a Western approach where we try to eliminate competing elements in the aim of a single truth or truth. So it raised the question for me around mutual contradictions in global health and how we can work in global health in a way that navigates our differences rather than silencing certain differences. So these were some of the themes that came out of the workshop. And as I said, we have 3 really fantastic speakers who will talk about the first 3 themes. And we're going to have them each speak before we have question and answer. So essentially, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. She'll speak. I'll introduce the second speaker. She'll speak. And then I'll introduce the third speaker. She'll speak. And then we will, I think, have a group photo and then go into the Q&A with our speakers. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Krishil Wateen, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Auckland. Her research centers on well-being, development, justice, and intergenerational equity, with a focus on the intersections of diverse philosophical traditions. And beyond the academic world, she also actively collaborates with Maori communities, contributing to both local policy development and global agenda setting. And today she's going to share her insights on relationality and kinship, Maori movements, a thought-provoking exploration into Indigenous perspectives on solidarity. So please join me in welcoming Krishil.
Morena tātou. So thanks for the invitation to learn with you all again, and that really kind introduction. So I'm currently dialing in from Birmingham in the UK, but of course I live and work in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in the little bit of time I have, I'm just going to say a little bit about Indigenous philosophies and some of the seeds of solidarity that we find there. So let's go. So often the basic starting point for Indigenous philosophies is relationships. So what this means is that for many Indigenous communities, valuing relationships and relating well is essential to a well-functioning society. And so to value relationships, it just basically means to recognize the importance of the complex and varied network of social and environmental connections and separations in which we, both as individuals and communities, live our lives. And when we're thinking about relating well, that just means to cultivate and negotiate and to navigate these relationships in this complex network of connections and separations in ways consistent with the pursuit and realization of individual and collective flourishing. So what's important is that these networks of relationships include not just relationships between human beings and human communities, but they stretch across diverse and multiple relatives with other non-human animals, with our flora and fauna, natural entities such as land and waterways and ecosystems. And similarly, these relationships extend backwards and forwards in time, right, in both physical and spiritual forms, as well as across vast distances in space to include everything and everyone in the present too. So we already get elements of kind of intergenerational thinking, of global thinking, and so on. This all these relationships fit in here. Right. And so what we mean is that in Indigenous philosophies, relationships often provide this really vastly inclusive and also multidimensional way of grounding and then structuring the conceptual framework and territory within which Indigenous philosophies not only take shape but continue to evolve. So what this means is ideas like kinship play a central role too. So when thinking about kinship, a really useful starting point is the work of fellow Indigenous philosopher Carl White, who reminds us that kinship relationships are relationships that are grounded in responsibility, right? That responsibilities are understood as bonds of mutual caretaking and mutual guardianship or stewardship, and that mutual caretaking and guardianship are practices of care that protect and reinforce these relationships, and then, of course, further embed these responsibilities. So it's not surprising that we find growing kinship networks or networks of solidarity amongst Indigenous and other local communities globally. These networks of solidarity reinforce the way that Indigenous and other local communities view the world as networks of communities connected to each other in a range of ways through our entangled histories, through our shared experiences, our practices, our commitments to protect, for instance, socio-ecological relationships, and also our aspirations for the future for things like cultural restoration, for instance. What's more, these networks show us that there are many places to find existing or long-standing stories of connection or solidarity, and many places to find and develop new stories of connection and innovation and community-led transformation too. One final insight I'd like to note is that within Indigenous philosophies and within Indigenous solidarity movements or kinship networks, we find a commitment to multi-generational thinking and practice as well. So for Māori and other Indigenous communities, our solidarity movements are grounded in many things, and one of those things is in the aspiration to leave behind thriving communities. And so this aspiration is reflected in the way that we live our individual and collective lives, hopeful that what we value, what we create, and what we pursue will endure over time. It's reflected in the way that we challenge and transform policies based in part on the legacies that those policies will chart and enable in the long run. And it's grounded and the acceptance that what we leave behind for future generations shapes not just how meaningful their lives will be, but how meaningful our lives can be said to have been as well. And so, in this way, Māori and other Indigenous communities embed a commitment to multi-generationalism. And that's a commitment to pursue projects that span several generations and that will only come to fruition long after the present generation are gone. Right. And our global systems, health and otherwise, I think can learn from such a commitment and can do much to enable these forms of kinship networks and solidarity too. And to do that, and to borrow again from Kyle White, we could say that these systems must cultivate a closer degree of mutual respect for different sources of knowledge, for different cultures, and different situations. Such global health systems will need epistemic infrastructures that recognize the fundamental role of Indigenous and other local knowledges, for instance, for conceptualizing, for pursuing, and for realizing global health. They'd rely on policy infrastructures that recognize and enable Indigenous and other social practices to pursue just and thriving socio-ecological futures. And then finally, they would need to recognize all of the kinship networks of solidarity that already exist, as well as enable those that could still exist globally too. Kia ora mai tātou. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chriselle. That was incredibly powerful, and I am really excited to talk a bit more in the small group work about what the implications of what Chriselle has just shared with us are for solidarity. For example, should global health solidarity extend to nature and non-humans, for example? Our next speaker is Professor Angela Ballantyne. She is a distinguished scholar in the field of bioethics and a former president of the International Association of Bioethics. She is a professor in the Department of Primary Healthcare and General Practice at the University of Otago, and her research spans critical issues such as exploitation, vulnerability, and the complex ethical challenges of using clinical data for research. And she focuses on data justice as well. Today, she's going to be speaking on trust and slowing down in data-driven health research, which is a very timely exploration of how ethical reflection must guide us in an era of rapidly advancing health technologies. Please give a warm welcome to Angela.
Kia ora. Thanks, Bridget, for that very kind introduction. Okay, so as Bridget said, I want to talk about some of the themes that emerged from our workshop in relation to health research. So data-driven health research can include data linkage, so just linking existing data sets, research and learning healthcare systems, where we're trying to more systematically learn from existing clinical practice. It can include AI, which obviously has enormous demand for data, precision medicine, and genomics. So there's lots of areas in health research at the moment that are increasingly data-driven. And what interests me is this really interesting intersection between a range of different concepts. So I'm sure many of you will have heard that there's concern in relation to AI and big data that can perpetuate existing bias. And that can happen for two reasons. One reason is that the existing data sets that we have aren't representative. So if you look at the data that's used for GWAS studies, so that's genomic-wide association studies, about 83% of that data comes from people of European ancestry, although only about 16% of the global population has European ancestry. So it's a really unbiased data set. And the other reason that data can be biased is because existing clinical data obviously reflects existing biases and barriers within our health systems. And that can be, issues of racism, marginalization, sexism, weight bias, for example. So our existing data sets are problematic. And one way to address that is to make our data sets more inclusive, right? So to scoop up more data to make sure that we have populations who are underrepresented. The problem with that is that a number of populations who are underrepresented are populations who are marginalized, and they have legitimate distrust often in government processes and institutions. So they might have distrust because data previously has been used, public health data, for example, has been used as a way of controlling populations, for example, in relation to land dispossession for Indigenous communities, removal of children, for example. There's concern that existing health research sometimes perpetuates stigmatizing or deficit narratives that emphasize consistently the ways in which certain populations are marginalized in the community, and that can be unhelpful, those deficit narratives. There's been a systematic failure to ensure that, for example, Indigenous communities actually get benefit from the health research they participate in. So really good reasons for distrust. When distrust is low, often there is a demand for consent mechanisms to be higher. So in high trust populations, often there's a more relaxed approach to consent for data use. Populations might be like, yeah, that's fine. We basically trust health researchers, so long as some basic mechanisms are in place, use the data. Obviously, communities that have lower trust are more likely to want more control over the data. So it's interesting to see the way these ideas intersect. Can I have the next slide, please? And so in particular, this leaves us with a trade-off in relation to data. So number one, we could just use the data sets we already have, But that's problematic because it's likely to result in unequal benefit because, as I said, there's bias in those data sets. So we could just kind of charge on using those data sets, but that will continue to increase health disparities. We could scoop up more data without consent. So often we have access to some of these data sets. We could bring them into our data set that we're using for research without asking. This is quite quick, it's efficient, and is likely to produce better research outcomes in terms of benefit for populations, but is understandably likely to generate more distrust and skepticism amongst certain populations. Or we can use mechanisms like consent or social license to try and gain legitimacy and demonstrate trustworthiness and integrity in the data. In many cases, consent is going to be really impractical if you're looking at, for example, 500,000 clinical records or even, millions of clinical data points. Getting consent can be really impractical, very expensive, and time consuming. Social license is an alternative. That's where we use government mechanisms to give communities control at kind of a governance level of data and how that's used to try and generate trustworthy, to try and generate trust. And so all of these approaches have benefits and drawbacks, and sometimes it might depend on how urgent the health question is. For example, if we're in a COVID pandemic, we might want to move more quickly. In other contexts, we might want to slow down and build trust. Sometimes we talk about moving at the pace of trust. And so that's working with our most distrusting communities and at their pace and a pace they feel comfortable at, as opposed to working at the level that our most trusting communities feel comfortable with. Next slide, please. When we're trying to engage underrepresented communities, there's been really interesting emerging research about the most effective way of doing that. And I think this points to an issue around relationship. So this is a great study done by Anne Middleton and colleagues in the UK that involved 100 people. If you click on it, I think we'll get the first part of the slide. Yeah, great. So what they were looking at is how you communicate the benefits of health research to different populations. And they said researchers intuitively, and I, agree with this, you want to go in and sell the benefit of the research, right? So it's really important that you participate. This research is for everybody. It needs to represent everybody. And that means we need to include people from more diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, and walks of life. However, what they found when this kind of pitch was used for low trust or skeptical communities, it actually didn't have the desired effect. So the participant response to this kind of pitch was, well, I heard you talk about everybody. So suddenly we can help everybody. Okay, so now what? Are we admitting there was a point when we weren't being helped? Even though, let's talk it as it is, we know that certain communities haven't benefited from health research. We don't get the same amount of help, or our concerns aren't taken seriously. So I think what this demonstrates is if you haven't established a kind of commonality and a sense of relationship first, then going in and pitching those potential benefits isn't going to land very well. And we did research in Singapore looking at public comfort with sharing genomic data of Singaporeans. And someone said something very similar in one of our focus groups. Look, if they don't trust you, they'll never trust what you say. Even if you let down all the facts, so for example, you tell about the benefits of the research, they'll just think it's fabricated. Whereas if they trust you, they'll trust what you say. So building trust and demonstrating trustworthiness, I think, is really essential before we go in and try and, sell the benefits of this data-driven research to particular communities. Next slide, please. So this slide's a little bit complicated to read, but I think it tells a really interesting story. So the Alderman Trust Barometer is a global survey of 28 countries with 32,000 participants, and it's run for 25 years, looking at different trust issues. So this research in 2024 was looking at trust and innovation. So for example, health-driven research. In the red column were people who said, actually, these innovations I'm not comfortable with. That was like green energy, AI, gene-based medicine, or GM foods. I don't like it. In the middle were people in grey, I'm kind of okay with this, but I'm not sure. And in green were people who embrace these innovations. Now, the white dots are people who most agreed with the statement, I don't think that people like me have any control over how these innovations are being implemented. The black dots are people who said, actually, I think people like me have quite a lot of control. We're involved in the governance. We're involved in the power structures around these innovations. So you can see that if people thought that people like them had control and power over how the innovation was used, they were much more likely to accept it. So this leads me to the point about thinking about governance models as opposed to consent models as a way of slowing down and building trust. Okay, so last slide. So I want to just finish with an example from New Zealand. So New Zealand has a really enormous data set called the Integrated Data Infrastructure, which includes data about health, but actually a whole range of our social services. And it's administrative micro-level data. And it can be used by researchers or by governments to understand certain, patterns and elements of life in New Zealand. We have a Māori data sovereignty group in New Zealand called Te Mana Rauranga, who argue and advocate for Māori data sovereignty, which they define as the inherent right and interest that Māori have in relation to the collection, ownership, and application of Māori data. And certain people involved with Te Mana Rauranga worked with Statistics New Zealand to establish a governance structure and a governance review process using Māori concepts in tikanga to decide which researchers could have access to the integrated data infrastructure. And this is a model which applies to anyone who's applying to use that data. And you might not be able to see it in detail here, but you'll better see it in the slides. It includes, so it's all based on Māori values. So for example, whakapapa is a focus on relationships. And so here the question is, are the researchers, do they have the appropriate relationships with community to be doing this sort of research? Tapu, for example, down the bottom, looks at sensitivity. So is the data particularly sensitive? Are there any particular concerns about privacy or identifiability, and have those been adequately addressed? So this is a governance system level response to thinking about communities who are understandably more distrusting of how data is used, and trying to give those communities more power and control over that data use. This does slow down research. So this isn't, I'm not pitching this as everyone's happy with this outcome. Certainly there are some researchers in New Zealand who think that this is too burdensome. And I think that's the trade-off, right? You can't always just sort of talk about trust as though that's something that's easy to build or achieve. And sometimes the price we pay for trust is slowing down the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. I think that's a really interesting look where you started to draw out, what slowing down and moving at the pace of trust would actually mean for the research process. And I think it'll be interesting to unpack that a little bit farther in the small group work, and also think about what slowing down might mean for global health programming and, for example, the delivery of clinical care in low and middle income countries, for example. So thank you for that. And now it is an honor to introduce Dame Catherine Healy, who is a renowned advocate for sex workers' rights, decriminalization, and justice. As the national coordinator and founding member of the Aotearoa New Zealand Sex Workers Collective, Dame Catherine has spent decades working tirelessly to improve the lives of sex workers through advocacy, education, and policy reform. Her leadership has shaped national and global conversations around rights-based approaches to sex work, grounded in dignity, equity, and social justice. Today, she joins us to present on sex worker solidarity and allyship, a really important discussion on justice, advocacy, and collective action in marginalized communities. So please give a warm welcome to Dame Catherine.
Thank you, Bridget, and hello to everyone in particular. I'd like to acknowledge Barbara, who is sitting there in the wings, who is responsible for my being here, I understand, through building relationships. My topic is to talk about sex worker solidarity and allyship. And as explained, I'm the founding member of NZPC, one of them, and we formed as a group of sex workers in 1987 and were, as then and now, motivated to advocate for the rights, safety, health, and well-being of sex workers. And one of the huge barriers for us at that time was the criminalisation of most sex work related activities. Trust wasn't there at all with official relationships. We were allowed to exist as such, but our sex work wasn't officially recognised, and there was regular enforcement of the laws we inevitably broke as a consequence as we carried out our sex work. This was disruptive at best and incredibly harmful to our overall well-being. The police targeted us and trapping us in undercover operations by posing as potential clients, which triggered arrests and appearances in court, where we were named as prostitutes in media reports. We were marginalised from access to justice if we were victims of crimes such as sexual violence or fraud. It's unlikely we would report these crimes committed against us, as the lens would turn on us as if we were the authors of our own misfortune and lawbreakers to be arrested ourselves. Ironically, there would be an outpouring of public sympathy if a sex worker was murdered, but in most other settings, support remained fairly muted. After years of advocating for criminalisation of prostitution or sex work, as we prefer to say, and building relationships with politicians from many political parties, as well as partnering with allies from an eclectic group of organisations and individuals spread across the public health and human rights, and surprisingly the feminist and religious sectors, we were able to encourage a small majority of parliamentarians to repeal those laws that repressed and harmed sex workers. New laws came into being in 2003, and as such, New Zealand became the first country in the world to decriminalise most laws related to sex work, which is considered the more progressive model over those such as legalisation that you may be aware of in other countries such as the Netherlands. Today, most sex workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, have laws that frame their work in a positive way. There is an exception made, a harmful exception for migrants who may not work as sex workers, even if they hold temporary visas to work in other sectors. It's a paternalistic there's lots of attachments I could make to that part of the law. The laws aren't perfect, but go some way to support sex workers to access justice and seek legal redress in many contexts, including those that affect their health and human and labour rights, as well as enabling sex workers to address exploitation. There are still issues that rain hard on sex workers, and these include stigma and discrimination. There are no anti-discrimination protections for occupational groups in Aotearoa. We look to certain states and territories in Australia where there are these protections for sex workers, and some of these protections explicitly state in these Australian jurisdictions that sex workers must be protected from discrimination. Well, stigma stalks sex workers. It's difficult even with supportive laws to come out as a sex worker, and there's always a fear of being judged. Parents are afraid their children will be removed from their custody if their sex work comes to the ears of the authorities. Bank facilities can be denied, locking sex workers into sometimes a more precarious economy. Stigma and discrimination can complicate housing options, but there are some victories to acknowledge, quite a few in fact. Some city councils and local body authorities in New Zealand have liberalised bylaws that determine where sex workers can work from, moving away from dramatically hostile stances that once outlawed such things as working as a sex worker from home. A lot of sex workers elect to meet and see their clients in their home situation as opposed to going out to other sex work venues. We've needed allies to lobby for these changes, and public health allies have been most effective in lobbying with us to achieve these changes. And I want to acknowledge also the research that's really contributed a lot to overturn some of these hostile bylaws. Suspected sex workers are turned back at the border of so many countries. Anti-trafficking or anti-migrant discourse may feed ideas that the suppression of sex work is the most effective way to protect people who are vulnerable, and visibility occurs in a myriad of settings, and sex workers can lose out on meaningful information in health settings if they feel unable to disclose their work. Many of you will come from countries where sex work is criminalised in some shape or form and strongly stigmatised. It's possible you are already strong allies for sex workers in these challenging environments. This would mean you recognise sex workers' work and would align with our global sex worker rights-based movement and its ideals, that there be no criminalisation, including the criminalisation of all sex workers, regardless of context or of clients and operators of brothels and other third parties associated with the safe running of sex work venues. Our allies need to support policies and practices that seek to integrate sex workers, not to repress, demarcate, and stigmatise. Good allyship would mean you support the resourcing of sex worker-led initiatives. You would recognise it's critical to accessing sex worker communities that there be peers who are adequately resourced to do so. It is important sex worker communities are heard and programs aren't peppered with a rescue saviour mix. The temptation to rescue sex workers from sex workers sometimes uppermost in the thoughts of our would-be allies. It usually comes as no surprise when sex workers describe bad labour practices such as bullying and coercion in the context of working in a brothel, for example. But what tends to surprise our prospective allies is that many sex workers will say that it is not the nature of sex work per se they need help with, but rather commonplace things like workplace bullying and bad labour practices from overly controlling management. Of course, there will be situations where sex workers will ask for help to leave sex work. These requests for help will be important to hear. Leaving sex work can be challenging on a number of fronts, but not usually connected to those dramatic scenarios so favoured in crime fiction. The ingredients for effective engagement and positive health outcomes for sex workers will be best realised if we stick to these basic principles. Let sex workers determine their account of what works and don't impose well-meaning solutions without a sign-off from sex workers. As an organisation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're most fortunate, more fortunate, I should say, than many sex worker-led organisations around the world. We've maintained a contractual relationship with government, which has enabled us to advance conditions that are supportive of sex workers. We are fortunate to have allies who stand in solidarity with us from a number of sectors, but we aren't there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dame Catherine. It's really impressive what you've helped achieve in New Zealand, though, as you say, it sounds like improvements are still needed legally and normatively. I think in small groups or even in wider group discussion, teasing out a bit more about allyship versus solidarity will be an interesting question to explore. I'm now going to hand back over to Julian. I think we have a group photo, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the speakers.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you so much to our speakers for the rich remarks and the discussions. I mean, there is so much that we can learn from what you've said. I cannot start to think about, where to start with the Q&A, and I'm hoping that people will rally behind me and ask you the questions. But before we launch into that, and before we, start getting heated up and smiling, hopefully, I think we can shift the photo to after, just before the group breakouts, if you allow me, so that we can at least start this heated discussion right now before we, go into the smiles and forget what we want to ask. So we've had the three speakers. Krishil talked about kinship and relations, and these relations being grounded in responsibility, and how this responsibility creates networks of communities and how they can connect with each other. And we also heard from Angela, who has talked about slowing down. I like how you posed the question, what does slowing down mean for, global health and the price to pay for trust is slowing down as the process. That was really good to know. And then Catherine Healy, you've talked about sex worker solidarity and allyship, and you vividly painted the picture of what the issues sex workers are have faced, but also the importance of allyship and what these allyship relations have created and advocated for to improve the situation. I can see, Barbara, you have your hand first to launch us into the discussion. Please, could you unmute yourself and ask a comment?
Thank you very much, Julian. I hope I'm not jumping the queue here, but I'd like to first thank the organizers and also the speakers for a really, really rich seminar so far. I would like to make a comment on the role of difference in solidarity, and also in a roundabout way answer hopefully part of Catherine's question. So I always get a bit uneasy when I hear the emphasis on difference in the context of solidarity. So I know that sometimes it comes from a very, very important place, and obviously it's important to acknowledge difference, but most of the conceptualizations of solidarity do that. They don't say solidarity is only taking place, when everyone is similar, but most definitions of solidarity say that despite difference, what gives rise to action in solidarity is what people have in common. So I think that given that we live in a world where so many policies and institutions build on difference, pit people against each other, I'm not sure that in a context of solidarity we should really emphasize difference. I think we should, in the acknowledgement of differences, see that, or emphasize that there are ways in which we can support each other institutionally, practically, on the basis of what we have in common, despite the difference. I think saying that solidarity, and I'm not saying that anyone here did this, but if we did say that solidarity can only take place in the context of similarity, that would be making a caricature out of the solidarity scholarship in that regard. So to Catherine's question, is solidarity with sex workers possible? That proves my point. If we emphasize difference, then we would say, anyone who has never been a sex worker could not be in solidarity with sex workers, which is the wrong way to go. I think we can acknowledge that there are groups that are, and other human beings who have so much in common with us, and they are marginalized or treated badly by policies and treated unjustly. And that is the similarity in a relevant respect that gives rise to solidarity. So I conclude, sorry that I've spoken for so long. The key thing about solidarity is that in light of difference, we build upon what we have in common, and we can find things that we have in common with a broad range of living beings, not only human beings, if we attend to these connections rather than the differences. So I think this is what solidarity is about. And if we understand it in this way, then solidarity across wide ranges of entities, people and other living beings is possible.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that is really good to answer some of these questions that have been posed to us. So it's not just the speakers who are on the spot to answer the questions, but this is, as you can see, interactive, and we're having a conversation. So you can answer, you can ask, and everyone, please just pitch in. So I'm going to get some of the questions from the chat to get us warmed up a bit, and we'll see where this is going. So there is a question for Angela. Are current ethical review processes sufficient to build trust in AI-driven clinical research? And what needs to change?
Yeah, I think AI is a good challenge for some of our existing research governance mechanisms. So particularly in health, in many countries, we still have predominantly biomedical research committees, ethics committees reviewing AI initiatives. Personally, I don't think that's appropriate. I think when some countries have developed special committees that have an expertise in data, and I think that's more appropriate. So part of the problem is general research ethics doesn't have sufficient technical skills in computer science and AI and the sources of bias to be reviewing these studies. And the other big challenge is in relation to global sharing of data. Obviously, most of our research ethics processes are national or institutional. And so that's a real challenge in terms of having global governance structures that can build trust across jurisdictions. One area where we're seeing that a little bit, it's not AI related, but are registries, particularly registries for rarer conditions. Often it doesn't make sense for an individual country to have a clinical registry. So that data might need to be shared internationally. And so that's a good model where we're starting to see some progress around cross-jurisdictional governance models.
Thanks, Angela. We're moving on. I would like to recognize one of the people. Actually, if we have people who are practicing more solidarity as well. Solidarity, not more solidarity. In South Africa, there's a group called the Rural Women's Assembly, and we have Mary Sakala, who has joined us in this group. You feel free to talk more and build on what has been shared today. I think you have more examples also to share in connection with this, and it's good to see you. And I can see more comments. I can just pick one comment who's just come in as well. The proof of the potential of allyship is that politicians have voted in parliament for legislation changes that have redefined sex as well. All of these elected politicians agreed that criminalization of sex work was wrong, and they agree that sex workers are doing work. I suggest this cannot be explained as cultural change alone. I don't know if this is a question or we need to build on this. Catherine?
Yes, well, I think Eleanor's referencing what's happened so fantastically in Australia, in Queensland in particular, most recently. And, it's, I think, the building blocks of the political movement really. Politicians as allies, they're tricky people, aren't they? I think. But I know that in the vote in Queensland, I think it was overpoweringly in favour of sex workers, whereas in Aotearoa we inched in. So yes, I think it's that allyship, that Scarlet Alliance and Eleanor's organisation built with the politicians was incredibly impressive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, keep them coming, but I'm going to choose a bit two more questions before we can launch into vivid discussions when we go into the breakout sessions. I see there are more questions coming in to you. Just one for Crucial. Is there any difference between Indigenous conception of intergenerational justice and the mainstream conception of it? Very good question.
Chriselle said in the comments that she had to leave. She had a workshop she had to attend. So we might maybe send that question on to her.
Okay, so I think there is then one which applies to all the speakers. How does global health reinforce othering, and how can global health challenge its othering instincts? And this is particularly a good question to all the speakers, or anyone who wants to comment as well. Feel free to come in.
That's a big question. I mean, taking Barbara's point, part of the concern about inclusion in relation to these data sets is a form of othering. So part of it is the question of to what extent can we do valuable research on European data sets that's actually of use to a range of populations, and to what extent are differences in genetic ancestry actually critical to understanding health. And the reality is in some cases it's not going to be necessary, and actually it puts a burden on other communities to have to share their data and expose themselves to the small but still risk regarding privacy and confidentiality. In relation to COVID, for example, there was a lot of concern about ensuring that our research projects were representative, and that meant a lot of direct recruitment of, for example, African American, other ethnically marginalized populations in the US, and asking people to participate in research is asking them to carry burdens. So I think we've got to be careful that we do need to think about inclusion and representativeness, but it's not a one size fits all. And sometimes it actually might be more appropriate to emphasize similarities and the extent to which the existing data set we've got is good enough to be able to benefit multiple communities. And we actually don't need to take up people's time and energy and genomes. And in other cases, it's going to be really critical. So I think we're moving into a phase that's moving beyond just like bias and inclusion alarm, and trying to have a more fine-grained analysis of where there are similarities and where there are important differences.
Thank you for that. Elena, would you like to elaborate on that? Your hand is up.
I had a point, but I feel like the point could go either way, but I'll contribute it anyway. I just getting back to what I had said, and also Catherine's thoughts. The fact that a category of others, like sex workers, could move from a criminalized population to a decriminalized population, I think shows the potential of solidarity. And then, for example, in a lot of the campaigns around Palestine, people often, in their thinking about it, will turn to South Africa and also use that as the end of apartheid is an example of. Sorry, did you hear any of that?
No, you went on for just a few seconds.
Oh, okay. So I just was saying that the example of South Africa is often used when other countries and people in other movements in other places are saying to each other, well, what can we do about Palestine? And other advocates say back to them, well, look what was achieved with ending apartheid when lots of countries and entities from different places were involved. And that's an example of solidarity. And I think with all of these examples, there is a clear group that is the other, and then there is solidarity that is being expressed about that group. And I wonder if moving beyond rhetoric means finding the group that is most marginal, most other, and extending solidarity to that group, because that is the most convincing demonstration that it's possible. No one except sex workers believed it was possible for decriminalisation to happen. Our movement has been calling for it since the 1970s. and it's not in every country now, but every sex worker believes it's possible. Outside of our community, we have to convince other people it's possible. They're just thoughts.
Great thoughts indeed. That I hear from you saying in standing with solidarity, even the people who are facing some of these issues, it generates some of the responsibilities on either side. And I can hear that clearly, that some of them have to ask for it and advocate for them, but also we have to choose and support those people in solidarity with them. Very, very good point. The chat is really on fire, and we had a few minutes to go into your breakout sessions. But I just want to highlight one more question from Dipshika, who was asking some bit of the question is, what are some of the examples of common rhetorics in global health solidarity, and how can we understand and challenge those ideas? Barbara mentioned a few examples and great points. What are some of the key points of resistance? Barbara, do you want to quickly highlight?
Sorry, Julian. I admit that I was now focused on the chat where I was asked a question. Could you just repeat the last question again that you asked me?
Yeah, so it's just building on you, and it's just not for you, but I chose you. What are some of the examples of common rhetorics on global health solidarity, and how can we understand and challenge those ideas? They said, Barbara, you mentioned a few examples and great points. What are some of the key points of resistance?
Of resistance against rhetorical uses of solidarity? Is that the... I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, no, I was saying key points of resistance when we talk about solidarity, and if we want to change the way it and make it more inclusive,
Okay.
when we want to make it more inclusive, there are political, discussions and discourse, and now there's so much on gender as well. There's
Yeah.
there's so much pushback. So what are some points of resistance that we need to consider as we define what is solidarity in global health?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I understand it now. So I'm not sure that I'm the best expert to answer this, because I'm not a global health scholar as such. So I'm a solidarity scholar, but I'll do my best to answer and then maybe hand over to a global health scholar. So first of all, and this is also what I typed into the chat while Julian was speaking, so exclusion from solidarity is not always problematic, I think. And I think Angela gave some very good points already. If I'm excluded from solidarity within a patient group and I don't have the disease, then my exclusion is not a problem. But if I'm excluded from universal healthcare, which is a solidaristic arrangement, then it is hugely problematic. So first of all, I think we need to ask when and where is it problematic? I would also argue it's not problematic if, rich patients or in rich countries are excluded from an arrangement that benefits others who have fewer resources. But points of resistance against pitting people against each other, I think there are 2 points of resistance. One, I think we need to push back against merely rhetorical uses of solidarity. So when solidarity is employed to actually further the interest of powerful economic or political actors, and they're sort of misusing the word, Sally Schultz has written on this, for example, I think we need to push back and say, this is not solidarity as we understand it, right? And that's part of what we do in this project. And the other point is that we just resist that people are pitted against each other, that we emphasize that in light of the differences that inevitably exist, there are commonalities, that we're all human beings who are afraid of illness and persecution and armed conflict. And even if we don't have experienced this ourselves, we can relate to this. This is something that binds us together. And we should not let powerful elites divide us across those boundaries. I think that's a point of resistance. I hope I have answered. I have at least tried to answer the right question. I'll shut up.
No, I love the discussion. I think you brought out so many points that even answer the other questions in the chat. And we could go on and have, a normal conversation And, you know, in the chat, you can also continue to contribute some of your views and comments to some of the questions and add them. So you're supposed to give us your key takeaways to wrap up us up in the discussions that have happened today. And then we'll just have a couple of highlights before we close.
Okay, great. I mean, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I mean, I really enjoyed this, and this is part of the learning that we're doing. We're working on solidarity, but we're also learning, and each meeting we learn more. And I think the beginning, when Crucial spoke about how to understand this web of relationships, of kinships, I think that is the real starting point. Because once we accept the kinship, then we can't allow anybody within the kindred or the kinship to suffer, to be treated unfairly, to be treated in a way that is unjust. And this is what appeals to solidarity. And so that is the deeper basis of similarity that we all have. And because of that similarity, we have similar desires. And therefore, when at any point, any member of the group of our kinship is suffering, then it becomes an issue that we should all take up and take it up seriously. And this kinship, of course, extends beyond humans and even to other beings. And of course, in context to it can even be, it can extend in time, the past and the future. So that's a very good takeaway that I got from today's webinar. I think I'll stop here.